Some stories begin with a mystery, others begin with a tragedy, but every once in a while a story begins with both and ends in a way that almost no one believes is possible. Imagine saying goodbye to your child on what feels like the most ordinary morning of the year. A quick wave, a short walk to the school bus stop, a promise to see each other that afternoon, then nothing. No phone call, no witness who could explain what happened, no clue that made sense, only silence. For one Northern California family, that silence lasted nearly 18 years. As weeks turned into months and months into years, hope slowly became something much heavier. Neighbors stopped talking about the case. News crews moved on. The missing posters faded under the California sun. Most people assumed the mystery would never be solved. After all, very few missing children are found after so many years, and when they are, the ending is rarely a happy one. But this case would become one of the most extraordinary exceptions in American history, because while the world believed an 11-year-old girl had vanished forever, she was still alive, hidden in a place no one thought to look, living only miles away from everyday life, behind ordinary fences, behind ordinary houses, behind a life that appeared completely invisible to everyone passing by. For nearly 2 decades, investigators searched for answers. The FBI followed leads across multiple states. Volunteers organized searches. Thousands of tips poured in. Psychics made predictions. Television programs revisited the mystery again and again. Yet every promising lead ended the same way, with disappointment. As the years passed, the case slowly became another heartbreaking cold file, or so everyone believed. Then, in August of 2009, something completely unrelated happened. A man visited the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. At first glance, there was nothing especially remarkable about him. He wasn't running from police. He wasn't acting violently. He wasn't connected to any active investigation. He simply wanted permission to hold a small religious event. But something about his behavior made university staff uneasy. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. The conversation felt strange. His answers didn't quite fit the questions, and the people accompanying him seemed unusually quiet. One campus employee trusted an instinct that would change everything, instead of ignoring the uncomfortable feeling. They contacted law enforcement. No one could have imagined what would happen next. A routine interview, a few ordinary questions, and one unbelievable answer. Within hours, investigators realized they weren't speaking to strangers. They were standing face to face with one of America's most famous missing children. A girl who had disappeared almost 18 years earlier, a case that countless investigators believed would never be solved. This is the remarkable true story of Jaycee Dugard, a story of disappearance, of unanswered questions, of extraordinary survival. Another single conversation that uncovered a mystery nearly 2 decades in the making. Where are you watching this video from? Leave your location in the comments below. I'm always curious how far these stories can travel, and how they manage to connect us across every distance. And now let's continue the story. June 10th, 1991. It was a Monday. For most people living in the quiet community of Myers, California, it began like countless other summer mornings. The Sierra Nevada mountains stood in the distance, their peaks still carrying traces of snow from the previous winter. The air was cool. The streets were quiet. Birds filled the morning silence while neighbors prepared for another ordinary day. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become one of the most unforgettable dates in modern American missing person history. For 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard, life had never been perfect, but it was filled with the simple routines that make childhood feel safe. She loved spending time outdoors. She enjoyed riding her bicycle through the neighborhood. Like many children, her age, she had favorite television shows, favorite snacks, and dreams that seemed as limitless as the mountains surrounding her hometown. Friends described her as polite and soft-spoken. Teachers remembered a student who blended easily into the classroom, someone who wasn't trying to stand out, but who was kind to those around her. She had just finished another school year and, like countless children across America, summer represented freedom, long afternoons, family time, and the excitement of growing just a little older. Jaycee lived with her mother, Terry Probyn, and her stepfather, Carl Probyn. The family didn't have a luxurious life, but they worked hard to provide stability. Like every parent, Terry worried about the usual things. Homework, school. Growing up, making sure her daughter stayed safe. She had no reason to believe that this Monday morning would be different from any other. That morning, Jaycee got ready for school as she always did. She gathered her backpack, put on her clothes, and prepared for the short walk to the school bus stop. It wasn't far from home, just a familiar route she had taken many times before. Her mother watched her leave. It was the kind of goodbye millions of parents say every weekday. Nothing dramatic. No long conversation. No feeling that this would be the last time they would see their child for nearly 2 decades. As Jaycee walked toward the bus stop, traffic was light. A few cars passed through the neighborhood. Some residents had already left for work. Others were just beginning their morning routines. Everything appeared completely ordinary. If someone had driven through the neighborhood at that exact moment, they would have seen nothing unusual. Just another child walking to school. Just another peaceful California morning. Across America, thousands of parents were watching their own children head off to school at almost the exact same time. Most of those children would return home that afternoon. Jaycee would not, unknown to everyone around her. Someone else was also watching that quiet street. Someone who had entered the neighborhood without attracting attention. Someone who, according to investigators, had already made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. But no one nearby knew it. No neighbor looked out the window with concern. No passing driver sensed that anything was wrong. There were no warning signs, no loud arguments, no desperate cries that echoed through the neighborhood for minutes. Everything happened with shocking speed. In cases involving missing children, investigators often discover a trail of clues. A suspicious phone call, an unusual encounter days earlier, someone behaving strangely in the neighborhood. This case appeared different. The morning had unfolded so normally that at first there seemed to be almost nothing for investigators to work with. Later, detectives would spend years reconstructing these final ordinary moments. They would interview witnesses, study timelines, measure distances, examine every detail of those few minutes. Because somewhere between Jaycee leaving home and the school bus arriving, the ordinary ended, and one of America's most heartbreaking missing person investigations quietly began. At that moment, her mother was still inside the house, believing her daughter was on her way to school. She couldn't possibly know that, only a short distance away. Everything had already changed, and within minutes, the normal rhythm of an ordinary Monday morning would give way to panic, confusion, and a search that would last nearly 18 years. For investigators, every missing person case begins with one question. When was the last moment everything was still normal? For Jaycee Dugard, that answer came down to only a few minutes. She had left home exactly as planned. Her backpack was over her shoulder. The school bus stop was only a short walk away. It was a route she knew well, a route that had never given her family a reason to worry. But on that Monday morning, someone else had entered the quiet neighborhood. According to investigators, a light-colored sedan slowly moved through the area. Nothing about the vehicle immediately drew attention. Cars drove through residential streets every day. Children waited for school buses every morning. It was the kind of scene people rarely looked at twice. Then, everything changed in an instant. The encounter lasted only moments, so quickly in fact, that many nearby residents had little time to understand what they were seeing. One witness later reported noticing a young girl being forced into a waiting vehicle. Another described hearing a brief scream before the car sped away. By the time anyone fully realized something was wrong, the vehicle had already disappeared. It was gone. No dramatic chase, no crowd gathering in the street. Only silence. The school bus continued its route, Neighbors continued their morning routines. And life moved forward, unaware that one of the most significant missing child investigations in American history had just begun. Back at home, Jaycee's mother had no reason to panic, at least not yet. She believed her daughter was sitting in class, just as she had on countless other mornings. Hours passed, then came the phone call no parent ever wants to receive. Jaycee had never arrived at school. At first, there had to be another explanation. Maybe she had missed the bus. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Her mother immediately began checking every possibility she could think of. Friends, neighbors, relatives. Every answer was the same. No one had seen her. The search began almost immediately. Family members drove through nearby streets, calling her name. They checked familiar places, parks, open fields, neighborhood roads. Every passing minute made the situation feel more frightening. Soon, local law enforcement arrived. Officers quickly realized this wasn't a child who had simply wandered away. Witnesses were already coming forward with troubling information. Several people had seen a suspicious vehicle. Others believed they had witnessed a frightening encounter near the bus stop. Suddenly, investigators were no longer looking for a lost child. They were racing against time. Experienced detectives understand that the first few hours after a disappearance are often the most critical. Roadblocks can still be established. Witness memories are still fresh. Physical evidence may still exist. Every minute matters. Officers spread across the area, speaking with anyone who might have been outside that morning. Drivers, neighbors, construction workers, delivery personnel, anyone who may have noticed a vehicle that seemed out of place. Search teams expanded outward from the neighborhood. Volunteers began arriving. Friends of the family joined the effort. Police dogs searched nearby fields and wooded areas. Helicopters scanned the landscape from above. The hope was simple. Find Jaycee quickly. Bring her home before nightfall. But as the day wore on, that hope began slipping away. Investigators searched roads leading out of the community. They checked nearby campgrounds. They examined isolated areas where someone might have abandoned a vehicle. Every promising lead ended the same way. Nothing. As news of the disappearance spread, television stations interrupted their regular programming. A photograph of 11-year-old Jaycee appeared on local broadcasts. Reporters urged viewers to call if they had seen anything unusual. The story quickly reached neighboring counties. Then the rest of California. Then, before long, the entire nation. Meanwhile, inside the Dugard family home, the atmosphere had changed completely. Only that morning, it had been filled with ordinary routines. Now it had become the center of an expanding search operation. Telephones rang constantly. Police officers came and went. Friends tried to offer comfort. But there were no answers. Only questions. Where was Jaycee? Who had taken her? Why her? And perhaps the most painful question of all, was she still alive? As darkness settled over Northern California, search crews refused to stop. Flashlights swept across fields. Volunteers called her name into the night. Parents from nearby communities joined complete strangers in the search, hoping they might be the one to find the missing 11-year-old girl. No one wanted to believe that the trail had already gone cold. But by the end of that first day, the child who had simply left home to catch a school bus had seemingly vanished without a trace. And investigators were about to discover that solving this case would take far more than days, far more than months. It would take nearly 18 years. By the morning of June 11, 1991, investigators were already facing a troubling reality. Jaycee Dugard had not simply wandered away. Every hour that passed without a credible sighting made the situation more urgent. Local deputies quickly realized they could not handle a case of this magnitude alone. State investigators were called in. Soon afterward, the FBI joined the investigation. The disappearance of an 11-year-old girl had become far more than a local emergency. It was now a national case. Detectives returned to the bus stop again and again. They measured distances, photographed tire marks, collected anything that might hold forensic value. Every witness was interviewed repeatedly, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times. Investigators weren't looking for dramatic new information. They were searching for the smallest inconsistency, a different color, a different direction, a forgotten detail. Because sometimes a single overlooked observation can solve an entire case. Witnesses generally agreed on one thing. A man had approached Jaycee near the bus stop. A light-colored vehicle had been seen leaving the area moments later. But descriptions varied. Some believed it was white, others thought it was cream-colored. Some remembered it as a sedan, others weren't sure. It wasn't unusual. Human memory is remarkably unreliable during moments of sudden shock. Detectives understood that. Still, they hoped. Someone somewhere had seen something just a little more clearly. Within days, missing person posters began appearing across Northern California. Then across neighboring states, Jaycee's school photograph appeared in grocery stores, shopping centers, gas stations, post offices, libraries. Everywhere people gathered. Volunteers worked late into the night, printing thousands of flyers. Many had never met Jaycee. Some had children the same age. Others simply couldn't imagine what her family was enduring. Entire communities came together. Search parties combed forests. Horseback riders explored remote trails. Boaters searched nearby lakes. Even experienced rescue teams admitted that they had rarely seen a community respond so quickly. Yet despite the enormous effort, nothing. No backpack, no clothing, no confirmed sightings. It was as if the 11-year-old had simply disappeared into thin air. Then the phone calls began. At first, investigators welcomed every lead. Someone believed they had seen Jaycee at a shopping mall. Another caller reported a young girl matching her description at a highway rest stop. One family claimed they had spotted her hundreds of miles away. Each report carried a small spark of hope. Detectives followed every credible tip. They drove for hours, interviewed witnesses, reviewed surveillance when available, compared photographs. Every lead ended exactly the same way. It wasn't her. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The stack of investigative files grew larger and larger. Every report was catalogued, every witness statement was preserved, every possibility was examined. Some investigators later described the case as one of the most frustrating they had ever worked, not because there were too few clues, but because there were too many. Thousands of tips poured into law enforcement. Many were offered by well-meaning citizens. Others came from people convinced they had solved the mystery. Some callers insisted they knew exactly where Jaycee was. Others claimed mysterious organizations were involved. A few even blamed complete strangers, with no connection to the case whatsoever. Each claim had to be evaluated. Each one consumed valuable time. Meanwhile, Jaycee's family refused to stop searching. Her mother, Terry, appeared on local television asking for help. Her voice remained calm, but the exhaustion was becoming impossible to hide. She pleaded with anyone who knew anything, no matter how small, to come forward. If you've seen her, if you know something, please call. Those interviews reached millions of Americans. Parents watched while holding their own children a little closer. Across the country, Jaycee's smiling school photograph became instantly recognizable. Her face appeared on television news, in newspapers, on bulletin boards, even on milk cartons, part of a nationwide effort to help locate missing children. For a while, it seemed impossible that someone could hide an entire child from the public. Surely someone would recognize her. Surely someone would make the call that solved everything. But months passed. Then another year. Gradually, the intense media attention began to fade. New tragedies captured national headlines. Other missing person cases emerged. Television crews packed up their equipment. The satellite trucks disappeared from the neighborhood. The cameras stopped arriving. But inside the sheriff's office, the investigation never truly ended. The case files remained open. Every few weeks, another possible lead would appear. Detectives would reopen maps, review old witness statements, compare fresh information against evidence collected years earlier. Again and again, the trail ended in disappointment. As time moved on, investigators were forced to confront a heartbreaking possibility. What if they had already missed the one clue that mattered? What if the answer had been sitting somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports? Hidden in plain sight? It was a question that haunted the investigation, because history had shown that some of the most famous criminal cases were solved only after detectives realized they had overlooked something that seemed insignificant at the time. So they kept digging, kept reviewing, kept hoping, even as the years slipped away. Then something happened that gave Jaycee's family a renewed sense of hope. A new witness came forward with information investigators couldn't immediately dismiss. The lead sounded credible, specific, detailed. Experienced detectives prepared for what they believed might finally be the breakthrough they had waited for. They moved quickly. Search warrants were discussed. Interviews were scheduled, for the first time in months. It felt as though the investigation might finally be turning a corner, but once again, the promising lead collapsed. Another dead end. Another painful reminder that finding Jaycee would be far more difficult than anyone had imagined. By the mid-1990s, many people quietly assumed the worst. They never said it aloud, not in front of her family, but hope had become increasingly difficult to hold on to. Only one group refused to give up completely: the people who loved her most, because while the rest of America slowly moved on, Jaycee's family continued waking up every morning believing that somewhere, somehow, she was still alive, as the headlines slowly disappeared. The waiting did not. For most Americans, Jaycee Dugard's disappearance eventually became another tragic story, remembered only in passing. People moved, children grew up, new schools opened, new neighbors arrived, life continued, but inside one home, time seemed to stop. For Terry Probyn, every new morning began with the same thought. Could today be the day? It was a question she had asked herself hundreds of times, then thousands, and every evening ended the same way. Without an answer. There is something uniquely painful about not knowing. Grief, as heartbreaking as it is, eventually allows people to mourn. But uncertainty. Uncertainty has no ending, no final chapter, no place to leave flowers, no certainty that hope should end. Families of missing persons often describe living in two worlds at once. One part of the mind prepares for the worst, the other refuses to stop believing. That was the reality Terry lived every single day. Friends noticed how ordinary moments could suddenly become emotional. A young girl walking through a grocery store, a familiar laugh across a parking lot, a glimpse of someone with similar hair for just a second. Hope would return, then reality would quietly settle back in. Every birthday became another reminder of the years slipping away. At first, the family imagined celebrating Jaycee's 12th birthday, then her 13th, then her 14th. Each year they wondered what she might look like now. Had she grown taller? Would they still recognize her instantly? Would she recognize them? Investigators faced the same difficult question. As children grow older, photographs become less useful. An 11-year-old's face changes dramatically over time. To keep the search alive, forensic artists created age-progressed images. Using computers and careful analysis, they estimated how Jaycee might appear several years later. Those updated images were released to the public. The hope was simple. Maybe someone had unknowingly seen her, maybe a co-worker, a neighbor, a cashier, a teacher. Someone might recognize the face of a teenager instead of the child who had vanished years earlier. Thousands of copies circulated once again. For a brief moment, public attention returned. New phone calls arrived. New leads were investigated. Again, nothing. Despite the disappointment, Terry refused to allow Jaycee's name to disappear. She accepted interviews whenever reporters asked. She attended community events supporting missing children. She worked with organizations that kept long-term cases in the public eye. Each interview carried the same quiet message. Please don't forget my daughter. It wasn't anger people noticed. It wasn't bitterness. It was determination. She understood something many families learn far too well. The longer a person remains missing, the easier it becomes for the world to move on. She wouldn't allow that to happen. Meanwhile, detectives continued checking in with the family. Sometimes they arrived with what sounded like promising information, a possible witness, a new tip, an anonymous phone call. Every time the telephone rang unexpectedly, emotions rushed back. Could this finally be it? Could someone have found her, more often than not? The answer was no. Over the years, investigators collected thousands of pages of reports. Boxes of evidence filled storage rooms. Maps marked with search locations covered office walls. Entire careers were spent chasing possibilities that ultimately led nowhere. Some detectives retired before the case was solved. Others inherited the investigation from officers who had worked it from the very beginning. But one thing never changed. Jaycee's file remained open, never forgotten, never officially abandoned. As the years passed, the world around the Dugard family changed in countless ways. Children who had once searched alongside volunteers became adults. Technology transformed criminal investigations. DNA analysis improved. Computers replaced filing cabinets. The internet changed how missing person cases were shared across the country. Yet despite every advancement, Jaycee remained missing. There were moments when even experienced investigators wondered if the truth would ever be known. Not because they had stopped trying, but because history offered very few examples of cases like this ending happily after so many years. Still, hope has a remarkable way of surviving, sometimes quietly, sometimes against all logic. And in the Dugard household, hope never completely disappeared. A framed photograph remained a constant reminder of the girl who had left for school one Monday morning. Family conversations still included her name. Her memory was never treated as something belonging to the past. She was part of the present. Always. Then, as the 18th year approached, something extraordinary was happening. Not at the sheriff's office, not at FBI headquarters, not because of a new piece of forensic evidence. Instead, the first crack in the mystery would appear in the most unexpected place imaginable. A college campus, hundreds of miles from the frantic searches of 1991. A place where no detective was looking for Jaycee Dugard, and where one ordinary conversation was about to change everything. For nearly 18 years, the biggest mystery wasn't where Jaycee had gone, it was how she had remained undiscovered for so long. As investigators would later learn, the answer wasn't hidden deep inside a remote wilderness. It wasn't across the country, and it wasn't outside the reach of law enforcement. It was hidden behind something far more ordinary. An ordinary house, an ordinary neighborhood, an ordinary-looking man. His name was Philip Garrido. To most people who crossed paths with him, there was nothing especially memorable about his appearance. He wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't attract much attention. He lived a quiet life in the city of Antioch, California. Neighbors often described him as unusual, but not necessarily dangerous. Some remembered him working in his yard. Others recalled seeing him riding a bicycle through the neighborhood. Many simply knew him as a man who kept to himself, but investigators would later discover that Philip Garrido was no stranger to the criminal justice system. Years before Jaycee disappeared, he had already been convicted in a serious criminal case. He spent years behind bars before eventually being released under supervision. His release came with strict conditions. He was required to report regularly to parole officers. His activities were supposed to be monitored. Authorities believed those safeguards would protect the public. On paper, the system appeared to be working. Reality would prove very different. After his release, Garrido settled into what looked like an ordinary routine. He married. He started a small printing business. He attended church from time to time. He spoke politely with customers. People who met him casually often described him as awkward, sometimes overly talkative, but rarely threatening. That contrast would later leave investigators asking an uncomfortable question. How could someone living under official supervision remain unnoticed for so many years? The property itself offered few obvious clues. From the street, it looked much like the surrounding homes. A modest front yard, a driveway, a garage. Nothing that would immediately cause concern, but behind the house. The layout became much more complicated. Over the years, additional structures had been built. Storage sheds, makeshift shelters, fences, layers of barriers that limited visibility from neighboring properties. From outside the property line, very little could be seen. The backyard had gradually become a world almost entirely hidden from public view. Neighbors occasionally heard voices. Sometimes they noticed movement. Children's laughter was reported by a few residents over the years, but explanations always seemed available. Perhaps relatives were visiting, perhaps friends had stopped by. Nothing appeared alarming enough to justify an emergency response. Looking back, many neighbors later admitted they replayed those memories again and again. Had they overlooked something important? Had there been signs that seemed ordinary at the time, but obvious in hindsight? Investigators asked themselves the very same questions. Because this wasn't a property that had escaped official attention. Parole officers visited Garrido on multiple occasions. Their job was to ensure he was following the conditions of his release. Reports were completed. Meetings took place. Questions were asked. Yet the hidden areas behind the house were never fully understood. Years later, those missed opportunities would become the subject of intense public scrutiny. Internal reviews examined whether warning signs had been overlooked. Could a more thorough inspection have changed the outcome? Could the case have been solved years earlier? Those questions remain part of the lasting legacy of this investigation. As time passed, Garrido's daily routine appeared almost predictable. He worked, he interacted with customers, he attended community events. He rarely behaved in ways that attracted immediate police attention. To the outside world, he seemed to be living a quiet, unremarkable life. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, investigators continued chasing leads that stretched across California and beyond. Search warrants were executed in distant counties. Tips arrived from other states. Possible sightings were investigated hundreds of miles from where Jaycee had actually been. Ironically, while detectives searched farther and farther from home, the truth remained astonishingly close. The years continued to pass. Technology improved. Cold cases were reopened. DNA solved mysteries that had baffled investigators for decades. Still, nothing pointed toward the property in Antioch. Then, during the summer of 2009, something changed, not because detectives uncovered new evidence, not because an anonymous tip reached the FBI, and not because a neighbor suddenly remembered an important detail. Instead, Philip Garrido made a decision, one that seemed completely unrelated to the Dugard investigation. He wanted to organize a small religious gathering. To do that, he needed permission to use facilities at the University of California, Berkeley. Third sounded routine, almost insignificant, but sometimes history turns on the smallest decisions. If Garrido had never driven to that campus, if he had never spoken with university staff, if one employee had ignored a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, the mystery of Jaycee Dugard might have remained unsolved for even longer. What happened next began with an ordinary conversation and ended with one of the most astonishing breakthroughs in modern American criminal history. August 26, 2009. By then, more than 18 years had passed since Jaycee Dugard disappeared. For nearly 2 decades, investigators had searched for breakthroughs that never came. No witness had solved the mystery, no piece of forensic evidence had pointed them in the right direction, and no detective could have predicted that the case was about to change, because of a conversation on a university campus. That morning, Philip Garrido arrived at the University of California, Berkeley. He wasn't there because of the Dugard case. In fact, no one on campus had any reason to connect him to one of America's most famous missing child investigations. His visit appeared routine. He wanted permission to hold a small religious event on campus. Universities receive requests like this all the time. Normally, the process is straightforward. Fill out paperwork, answer a few questions, schedule a date. But almost immediately something felt off. Staff members later recalled that Garrido dominated the conversation. He spoke rapidly. His thoughts seemed to jump from one subject to another. Simple questions often received unusually long answers. At times, his behavior made the discussion difficult to follow. One employee tried to steer the conversation back to the event permit. Instead, Garrido continued talking about religion, personal missions, and ideas that seemed disconnected from the questions being asked. The meeting grew increasingly uncomfortable. Then staff members noticed something else. Garrido had not arrived alone. Waiting nearby were 3 young girls. With them was an adult woman. She remained unusually quiet throughout the visit. She rarely interrupted, rarely volunteered information. Mostly she watched. At first, nothing about the group clearly suggested criminal activity. Families visited the campus every day. Parents often brought children. There was no obvious emergency unfolding in front of anyone. Yet something about the group's dynamic didn't feel right. Experienced employees often develop a sense for unusual situations. They may not immediately know why. But years of interacting with the public teach them to notice subtle details. The girls appeared hesitant. The woman seemed withdrawn. Garrido answered nearly every question directed toward the group. He controlled the conversation almost completely. When staff members attempted to engage the others, Garrido frequently responded before anyone else had the opportunity. It wasn't proof of a crime, but it was enough to leave several people uneasy. One university employee later explained that the encounter simply didn't make sense. The pieces didn't fit together. Why did the adult woman seem so reluctant to speak? Why were the children so quiet? Why did Garrido appear determined to speak for everyone instead of dismissing those concerns? The employee made a decision that would change history. A call was placed to the University of California Police Department. It wasn't an emergency call. There was no report of violence, no accusation that anyone had committed a crime. The message was much simpler. A staff member had encountered a visitor whose behavior seemed unusual. Could an officer stop by and speak with him? Officer Lisa Campbell was among those who responded. Like the university staff, she initially knew nothing about Jaycee Dugard. Her assignment was simple: talk with the visitor, see if everything was in order. When officers approached Garrido, he remained cooperative. He answered questions politely. He explained why he had come to campus. Nothing immediately justified placing him under arrest. But as the conversation continued, the officers began noticing the same inconsistencies the university staff had observed. Garrido talked constantly. His explanations wandered. Simple questions produced complicated answers. Meanwhile, the woman standing nearby remained remarkably quiet. Officer Campbell gently shifted her attention toward her. She introduced herself, asked a few basic questions. The woman answered softly. Her responses were brief, careful, almost rehearsed. Nothing she said was obviously false, yet something still felt incomplete. Then came another observation. The children referred to Garrido and his wife as their parents. That by itself wasn't unusual, but the timeline Garrido described didn't seem entirely consistent with the ages of the children. The details were vague. Some answers changed slightly as the conversation continued. Individually, none of those inconsistencies proved anything. Together, they raised questions. Officer Campbell decided not to let the matter end there. Rather than sending the group on their way, she contacted Garrido's parole officer. It was a routine step, after all. Garrido was still under supervised release. His parole officer, Ernie Allen, immediately recognized the name. Within a short time, Allen arrived on campus. Unlike the university staff, unlike the responding officers, Allen already knew Garrido's criminal history. That knowledge changed the entire tone of the encounter. Began asking more direct questions. Where had Garrido been living? Who exactly were the woman and the children? Why had they never been mentioned during previous supervision visits? The answers came slowly. Some didn't seem to fit, others created entirely new questions. Allen made a decision. The conversation needed to continue. Somewhere quieter, away from the busy campus, Garrido agreed. He, the adult woman, and the children accompanied officers to a nearby office for further interviews. At that moment, no one believed they were about to solve one of America's most famous missing person cases. They simply thought they were looking into a situation that deserved a closer look. But over the next several hours, one carefully asked question would lead to another. Small inconsistencies would begin to unravel, and the identity of the quiet woman who had barely spoken throughout the day would soon leave even seasoned investigators speechless, because after nearly 18 years, Jaycee Dugard was finally about to tell someone who she really was. The interview began as a routine conversation. Investigators had no search warrants, no dramatic discoveries, no evidence connecting Philip Garrido to one of the nation's longest-running missing person cases. At least, not yet. Inside the interview room, officers followed a simple approach. Rather than confronting anyone with accusations, they asked straightforward questions. They wanted to understand the relationships within the group. Who were the children? How long had they lived together? What were their names? When had they become a family? Philip Garrido answered confidently. But as the interview continued, investigators noticed small inconsistencies. Some dates did not seem to match. Certain details changed when the same questions were asked in a different way. The differences were subtle, but experienced investigators knew that seemingly minor inconsistencies could become important. Meanwhile, officers spoke separately with the adult woman who had accompanied Garrido. Away from his presence, the atmosphere changed. She remained calm, but reserved. Her answers were polite and careful. She identified herself using a name that investigators would later determine was not her true identity. Nothing in her manner suggested panic. Instead, she appeared to be someone who had spent many years avoiding attention. The investigators did not rush. They understood that trust often develops slowly. Rather than pressing for dramatic admissions, they continued asking about everyday life. Where had she lived? How long had she known Garrido? Did she have family members? Were there people who might be worried about her? Some answers were brief. Others were difficult to verify. As the conversation continued, investigators sensed that there was more to the story than was being said. Outside the interview room, parole officers were reviewing Garrido's background. His criminal history was well documented. That history alone justified taking a closer look at the circumstances surrounding the people living with him. The questions became more detailed. Investigators compared the statements given by Garrido with those provided by the woman. The timelines did not fully align. Certain events were described differently. No single inconsistency proved that a crime had occurred, taken together. However, they suggested that further investigation was necessary. Hours passed. The interviews continued. Officers maintained a respectful tone throughout. Their goal was not to pressure anyone into speaking. Their goal was to understand the truth. Eventually, one investigator asked a simple question. If there is anything you want us to know, this is the time to tell us. The room fell quiet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the woman began to speak more openly. She acknowledged that the identity she had been using was not her real one. Investigators listened carefully. They asked follow-up questions. Where had she been born? Who were her parents? How old had she been when her life changed so dramatically? As additional details emerged, the investigators realized they might be hearing something extraordinary. The information pointed toward a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 18 years. Rather than jumping to conclusions, they worked methodically. They contacted other law enforcement agencies. They reviewed historical missing person records. Names were compared. Dates were checked. Piece by piece, the information began to fit together. The possibility was almost impossible to believe. Could this quiet woman truly be the child who had disappeared in 1991? Investigators knew they needed confirmation. Records were examined. Family information was reviewed. Additional identifying details matched what had been preserved in the original case files. Evidence became increasingly convincing. Then came the moment that transformed the investigation. The woman confirmed her identity. She was Jaycee Dugard. For several seconds, the room was silent. Even seasoned investigators later described the moment as difficult to process. The missing 11-year-old girl whose photograph had appeared on television, in newspapers and on posters across the country, was no longer a missing child. She was a 29-year-old woman standing in front of them. Nearly 18 years had passed since she had left home to catch her school bus. Against overwhelming odds, she had been found alive. Within minutes, the information began moving through law enforcement channels. Supervisors were notified. The agencies that had worked the case for years received the news. Detectives who had spent portions of their careers searching for answers finally had the breakthrough they had hoped for. Soon afterward, Jaycee's family was informed. For years they had lived with uncertainty. Now, for the first time since June 1991, they knew something they had long feared they might never learn. She was alive. The search that had lasted nearly 2 decades was finally over, but while one chapter had come to an end, another was only beginning. Investigators still had to determine exactly what had happened during those missing years. They also faced another important responsibility: ensuring that Jaycee and the 2 children with her received privacy, support, and the opportunity to begin rebuilding their lives away from the public spotlight. Across the country, news organizations interrupted their regular programming. The announcement spread rapidly. One of America's most enduring missing person mysteries had finally been solved. For millions of people who remembered seeing Jaycee's photograph years earlier, the news seemed almost unbelievable. After 18 years, hope had become reality. The confirmation changed everything within hours. Once Jaycee Dugard's identity was verified, the entire structure of the investigation shifted from search to response. The focus was no longer on finding a missing child. It was now about protecting a woman who had just re-emerged into the world after nearly 2 decades away from it. Authorities acted quickly and carefully. Privacy became the priority. For the first time in 18 years, Jaycee was no longer a case file, a photograph, or a name on a poster. She was a person who needed time, safety, and space to process what had just happened. Outside the law enforcement system, news began spreading rapidly. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Online headlines repeated the same extraordinary sentence in different forms. After nearly 2 decades, she had been found alive. For many people across the United States, the reaction was disbelief. This was a case that had faded from public attention years earlier, a story people had grown up hearing about, but assumed would never have an ending. Now, it had, and not in the way most people expected. Inside law enforcement, the emotional impact was just as strong. Many investigators had worked on the case at different stages of their careers. Some had been there in the early years, others had inherited the file later. All of them shared the same feeling: relief, mixed with shock and reflection, because for so long This case had represented one of the most difficult realities in missing person investigations. Even the most experienced teams cannot always solve cases quickly. And sometimes, answers arrive in ways no one anticipates. Meanwhile, Jaycee's family was informed. There are moments in life that cannot be fully captured in words. This was one of them. After years of uncertainty, imagination, and unanswered questions, they finally received the truth they had waited for. She was alive. That simple fact carried more emotional weight than anything else. It did not erase the years of pain or uncertainty, but it changed everything about the future for the first time in nearly 18 years. The family had something they had lost long ago, a direction forward. Shortly after confirmation, arrangements were made for a private reunion. No cameras were allowed, no public announcements were made in advance. The focus was entirely on rebuilding connections that had been suspended in time. When the meeting finally happened, it was not a moment of spectacle. It was quiet, emotional, and deeply personal. Years of separation cannot be undone in an instant. There is no simple return to how things once were. Instead, there is a gradual process of recognition, understanding, and rebuilding trust. Each conversation carried weight. Each memory had to be revisited carefully. For Jaycee, the world she returned to was very different. From the one she had left as a child, technology had changed. People had changed. Even language and culture had evolved. But one thing had not changed. Her family had never stopped hoping. As the days passed, law enforcement continued working to ensure stability and safety. Investigations into the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were ongoing, but handled with strict attention to privacy and sensitivity. Officials emphasized that Jaycee's recovery was now the most important priority. Across the country, public reaction continued to grow. Many people who had followed the case in the 1990s found themselves revisiting old memories. Some remembered seeing her face on missing posters. Others recalled television segments that once asked for the public's help. For them, the resolution felt almost surreal, a reminder that even long cold cases can still find answers. The case also led to broader conversations about supervision systems, reporting structures, and how missing person investigations evolve over time. Not to assign blame in hindsight, but to understand how improvements might help prevent similar outcomes in the future. Still, beyond all the headlines and discussions, there remained a human story at the center of everything. A child who had once left home on a normal morning, a family who never stopped looking for her, and a moment, nearly 18 years later, when two worlds finally reconnected. The past could not be changed, but the future, for the first time in a very long time, was open again. And that alone was enough to begin healing. Some cases close with answers, others close with justice, but a few remain in memory long after the headlines fade. The story of Jaycee Dugard is one of those rare cases that continues to be remembered not only for how it began, but for how it ended. For investigators, it remains a reminder that persistence matters, even when progress feels impossible. For families of missing persons, it remains a reminder that uncertainty does not always mean absence, and for the public, it became a story that challenged expectations about time, hope, and resolution. In the years following her recovery, Jaycee focused on rebuilding her life privately. She also chose, later on, to share parts of her experience in her own words, helping others better understand the long and complex process of recovery after years of separation from the outside world. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the case is not found in headlines or reports. It is found in the simple fact that hope, even when stretched across nearly 2 decades, did not disappear completely. This was not a story with easy explanations. It was not a case solved quickly or neatly. It was a reminder that behind every missing person report is a real human life, and a family waiting for answers. And sometimes, against all expectations. Those answers do come. 18 years after she disappeared on a quiet California morning, Jaycee Dugard came home.